Well, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today. And just before we get started in our million questions that we sent you, so our firm does consulting for cities and counties throughout the state. I'm sure Kelly told you a little bit about it. And my specialty in the firm is affordable housing. And so I'm on the San Diego Housing Federation Policy Committee and kind of, wrapped into multiple facets here. Oddly enough, when we started this, it wasn't during the COVID epidemic, and now it is. So some of our questions are kind of going both ways, but we thought it would be kind of helpful to pick your brain a little bit as we're, trying to assist, cities and counties are our primary clients and local governments on how to, one, kind of address the housing crisis and better ways to kind of work with HCD and, programs that are existing. And then two, the second part of this, which is kind of coming from the COVID epidemic, is, what are some potential avenues and ways that we could potentially get some kind of short-term ideas or ideas that could potentially help communities address the COVID issues related to housing and community development, since things are shifting, and we all know in about 60 days from now, the world is going to be, we haven't even really felt the hit of what's going on locally. So, so that's kind of why we asked you to discuss with you. So thank you again for agreeing to do that.
Sure. No, my pleasure.
So I guess the first kind of question that we have is, there's many programs at HCD, and sometimes they seem to work really well. Other times they seem to be a little underutilized. And I know there's been a lot of discussions about even for like funding applications for affordable housing projects, or trying to kind of streamline all the different application processes and whatnot. And I wanted to kind of just get your take on the programs that you potentially felt were maybe underutilized by local governments when your time there, and maybe how we could better access those resources. And then conversely, which ones seem to work really well and why?
Yeah. So first, I don't think, there are not a lot of sort of nickels hidden under the sofa cushions at HCD. I think the reality is that the funding that the state does get does make its way out, and maybe not as quickly as we would like, but it does get out eventually onto the street. I think what frustrates a lot of folks out there in local government and developers of affordable housing is just how many different sources there are and how confusing the various processes are to access those funds. Right. And one of the things that, like, some modest things that has been really helpful is just, HCD now has a regularly updated calendar on its website with, here's the 30 different funding sources and when the NOFAs are expected and when the applications are expected. And that's a great resource for folks, because those both just knowing when they're scheduled for and then being able to find a place as they inevitably slip as well. Just coordinating and aligning funding. I mean, one of the big opportunities I think for HCD and for the state more broadly is to figure out how to make it simpler. Right. Again, particularly on the affordable housing development side. And one of the opportunities clearly is, right now you have to you start with a competitive application with HCD, and then you have a competitive application with the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee for Taxes and Bond Cap Authority, and then you have a competitive application with the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee for competitive tax credits, and maybe you go over to Cal HFA. So I think there is pretty easily a way to get where you say, okay, we're just going to have one competitive application at the state, and if you win, then you're guaranteed to be able to, at least there's no more competitiveness to get the remainder of the sources that are necessary to fill out your capital stack.
Right.
Cal HFA piloted something like this for their mixed income program, where they, through legislation, got an allocation of bond cap. And so if you win that mixed income funding source from Cal HFA, you now automatically get the bond cap. And I think that's a great model that folks in the state are looking at and thinking about trying to replicate.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. I know from a local government perspective, we're often asked to provide gap financing for the projects as well. And it's interesting with some of the clients, they're okay kind of, all in early on in the process. And there's others that we want to see that you've got most of your other funding sources first. And so it's kind of like, this chicken and egg thing between all the different funding sources and commitments, and when you have all your players on the line, which I know drive a lot of developers, I'm sure, are pretty bonkers trying to just hit all of their different funding sources, and really can kind of slow down the process. So, I love the idea of being able to streamline things a little bit more and making it a little bit more simple of a process. And then, I think it's probably no surprise that there's some local governments that are feeling a little bit like, hey, we're being blamed for, the lack of housing production in the state of California. Probably some rightfully so, and others that have been, trying to do their part with the resources they have available to them. In the last few legislative cycles, there's been, a lot of pressure put on local governments to streamline housing development and to make it a little bit of easier process. And so in some cases, that's created a little bit of a rub. And so, one of the questions that we have and are kind of interested is, how can HCD and developers and local communities kind of work together a little bit better to address and solve the housing crisis?
Yeah, great question. So first, I guess I would just start by saying, as a going in assumption, I don't think it's tenable for cities to sort of say, hey, we're not going to be supportive of new housing in our communities. I think, first of all, that probably violates state housing laws. And second of all, no city is an island. Every city is part of a region. And to the extent that cities aren't helping facilitate their fair share of housing, there are spillover consequences to their municipal neighbors and the rest of the region in which they reside. And I also think, there's a greater clarity now among our elected leadership, particularly in Sacramento, that sort of decades of anemic supply of new housing at all income levels has been a real driver on things like income inequality, diminishing economic mobility, complicating our ability to be successful in climate goals. All this stuff, health issues are tying back. Increasingly, there's more visibility that these are tying back into some of the policy issues around housing. I think in a best case scenario, you would have a framework where the state basically says to a city, hey, look, if you are doing a good job, and if you can show you're doing a good job of permitting new housing at all income levels, then sort of have as much local control as you want. But if you can't do some bare minimum amount of being facilitated to new housing, then we have to let developers have recourse or have other options as ways to make sure that we continue to have some degree of development happening in those communities. For cities, I think the really constructive opportunity to engage in all this is right in front of them through the sixth cycle of the regional housing needs allocation. So recall that every 8 years, cities are tasked with doing comprehensive planning on their housing front. And they have to, in that planning effort, be able to show back to the state and to the regional as well, that they are planning for their fair share of housing, and not just zoning for it, but actually putting in place programs and practices and policies and staffing that a reasonable observer from the outside would look at and say, yeah, that makes sense. This is a decent framework that's likely to produce the kind of housing that represents your fair share. And so I think cities have an opportunity to really engage in that and take advantage of that as a way to sort of onboard new best practices and think about ways to streamline their approvals and also to just do more of the planning at the front end, right? A lot of the problems that we face in housing is cities fall behind on doing good planning, on doing good land use, and doing good environmental analyses. And so when a development does pop up and wants to move forward, you have to sort of start over from scratch. And that politically is much harder and is much more likely to draw opposition and be much more expensive and be much more delayed than if you can get a lot of that good planning done at the front end.
Right, during the housing element process.
Yeah. Exactly.
Do you see, it's happened a little bit with some of the newer funding sources that are coming out from the state, but it seems like there's a lot more linkage to, if you're a good player, then you have more access to resources. And if you're kind of on the naughty list, then potentially you wouldn't have much access to state resources. Do you see that kind of being something that would continue? It kind of might be sort of the norm as we move forward. And then another kind of related question is, for those good players that are really trying, are there potentially some rewards or incentives for those communities that are doing, their part?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think that's very much what this governor is trying to make happen. I think it's actually, some of that stuff was already in the works under Governor Brown, but I think Governor Newsom really has embraced it. Actually, within a month or two of his being inaugurated, he actually hit a little bit of a political backlash because he expressly said, well, let's link housing production to your ability to access SB1 roads and infrastructure funding, which had just barely survived a ballot measure to recall the gas tax, as you might remember.
Yeah.
And didn't move forward on that. But the idea is still there. And I think his thinking has also gotten a little bit more nuanced. And the basic framework is reasonably simple. It's, look, there is a minimum set of expectations that the state has for every city. You have to have a compliant housing element that has been reviewed by HCD. You cannot deny projects approvals if they are otherwise eligible to be approved under the State Housing Accountability Act. You cannot arbitrarily deny developers who want to use the state density bonus law. Like, there are a bunch of state housing laws, and increasingly the idea is if you violate those state housing laws in a consistent pattern, or you do not have a housing element approved, then you fall out onto the bad actors list, if you will. And then you're subject to a bunch of sanctions. So you automatically lose eligibility for a number of planning grant programs, some cap and trade dollars, some housing infrastructure grant programs. So these are programs that the city would otherwise have to apply for. You're just not eligible at all.
Right.
And then on the other end of it, what the governor proposed in the budget for this year, which HCD is working to implement, is something that's called a pro-housing designation. And so this is sort of the other end of it, which is, okay, we have a pretty good sense of when you have a bad actor, like you're just violating state housing law, you're taking unlawful actions. How do we know if you're a good actor? Well, I think to simply say you're permitting a lot of housing, it doesn't work. That's actually too blunt of a tool, because sometimes cities can actually have bad policies in place but still have good market conditions. And sometimes cities can do all the right things, but they're in a region that's not economically vital, or they're going into an economic slump. And so the pro-housing designation process basically says, okay, well, we actually know a fair amount about what the policies and practices are that tend to correlate with getting a lot of housing done. It's things like less discretion in the process, having more of your residential land environmentally cleared beforehand, having lower mandatory parking ratios, having lower impact fees and exactions that impose a higher cost on housing, having larger zoning capacity or zoning envelope. And you can kind of go down a list of things where there's actually often good research or good best practices. And so you can say to a city, look, whether or not you're permitting a lot of housing, if we can see that you've taken all these actions and have all these best practices, then you'll go on the pro-housing list. And HCD and the governor's thinking is that basically once you go on that list, then you get preferential treatment for competitive funding sources, not just housing funding, but other state transportation and infrastructure funding. You get an extra 5 points on your application or whatever it is that will make you more likely to be successful.
Right. So everybody should probably get ready for this if they want to get their hands on future funding, for sure. So kind of switching gears a little bit. So, our firm deals a lot with we did redevelopment, a lot of them. We established a ton of project areas throughout the state when redevelopment was a thing. And so we still are assisting a lot of our clients with the, wind down of affairs and activities, both on the housing side and the non-housing side. As it relates to the housing portion, there's housing successor agency funds that are out there. And part of what our firm helps our clients with is helping to get the properties on the market for development and get those funds out to develop affordable housing projects. We have some clients now that are really concerned about, there's a small portion of that, about $250,000 a year, that can be used for homelessness and rapid rehousing. And we're seeing that a lot of our clients are really interested in kind of unrestricting that a little bit to still be used for homelessness, but more of at risk in this kind of short-term period during COVID to potentially help some of those lower income households that aren't in a restricted property, right? That are at risk of potentially becoming homeless, and seeing if some of those caps could potentially be lifted. It's just an idea that's kind of getting tossed around now. We know we'd have to have the governor, either make an executive order or try to get through some quick legislative process to amend that piece of legislation. But I guess we're kind of wondering what your thoughts would be on that. And then if, we did want to try to push some idea like this forward, what's the best way to do that and do it quickly so that we can get funds freed up at a local level where they have housing money. It might just be for this particular use, and we want to, twist it up a little bit and get it free so that we can use it for similar use, but that could potentially help more people based on the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, really interesting idea. So first, I would just say, as a policy matter, this is something that has popped up in the conversation on homelessness funding with some regularity, which is folks will often say, hey, instead of investing our scarce homeless dollars in people who are already on the street, let's invest those same resources and keep people from going on the street in the first place. Right. That's a very compelling argument, and there have been some good approaches, I think, that have done that, but it turns out that I think the core challenge is that there is a vast universe of people who are potentially homeless. Wow. That's the nature of being a Californian today, is that you're one paycheck or one COVID-19 round away from actually being out on the street yourself. And so it's very hard as a policy matter, although the idea is good, it's very hard as a policy matter to target your investments to just those folks who are about to be homeless. And if you make it available to the entire universe, your money, poof, goes away immediately because it's spread so thin. So I think that's the one thing just to be thoughtful about as a policy matter. On the actual funding source, I think one of the challenges that we've got to all start wrestling with is just going to be, what the heck is going to happen to our municipal and state balance sheets in the next year? I think we're looking at some initial forecasts that started to come out in the news, but a lot of the state and local government's budgets are just going to start cratering. And so I think the governor and his Department of Finance and the budget committees in the Senate and Assembly at the state level are already very much focused on, at a minimum, they've got to bring a budget back for the next year that is certainly flatlined. I mean, the word coming out is this budget is just a stay in place budget at best. So those successor agency funds that you allude to have been very tightly controlled. Actually, I mean, they came out of the last financial crisis. I mean, they were it's like the reason they are so tightly controlled by the state already is because the state was trying to recapture that funding to plug big holes 10 years ago. And I think any effort to reopen that probably has to start and stop again with the governor and the Department of Finance to try and create that space. But I would say, like, now's the time to do that, because while we are likely going to face a budget crisis at the state, what's even more pressing right now is just dealing with the crisis. And a big part of that crisis is the homelessness and its interference with COVID. So I would encourage you to both work with other trade associations and particularly the groups like the California League of Cities and California State Association of Counties and the councils of government are all very active in Sacramento and have good connections in with the government. But I would encourage you to put that idea on paper and work with some other advocacy organizations and bring that right away to the governor. The governor actually releases his May revision to his January budget proposal in the beginning of May. So, if that idea were to get traction, it would certainly help to give it to folks in the governor or his team within the next several weeks.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's really helpful. And we are kind of putting some pen to paper. I know one of our clients in the Bay Area is really interested in the idea. And so we're trying to kind of get some movement there, just, because if we have some funds that potentially could help in, on a temporary basis, even if that cap was lifted for 12-month period or something and then put back, I think even that could be a win on a short term.
Absolutely.
Just kind of based on your insight, in time working with HCD, do you have any other ideas on potentially how local governments could help try to kind of address the COVID issues as it relates to just kind of community development in general, as far as keeping businesses operating and keeping people housed right now, kind of seem to be our two major priorities. And potentially some ideas or ways that they could maybe focus funds or strategize or work collectively to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good work that needs to happen out there. Just to offer a couple of thoughts. One is there are still a lot of local governments that are very much behind the curve in terms of just moving their functions online.
Yeah.
They've historically really done much of their work over the counter, or much of it is paper-based. They don't have good data portals for just so the citizens can track the status of the applications they've submitted that are in the pipeline. Some cities have done great work, right? So there's a whole spectrum out there. And I think one of the things that we need to take this moment to look at is like, how can we accelerate that online migration for those cities that have fallen behind? The good news there, I think, from a housing perspective, is there are some very significant pots of technical assistance that the state has made available, including $250 million that came out of the current year budget cycle, which cities have until the 1st of July to put in an application for, totally open as to what cities want to do with their funds. Right? Yes, exactly. A lot of flexibility. So I think this is a great place where, hey, if you don't have a good way just to process applications online, like take this money and just get that working before you do anything else, in my view. We talked as well about the opportunity that the housing element presents many cities as they go into that cycle. I think the housing element is going to feel very daunting to cities as they are dealing with what feels like a much more pressing needs. Mm-hmm. But I think it's going to be important to not let that languish because it will ultimately, I think, putting in place more thoughtful and effective housing policies, procedures, and zoning will be part of the economic recovery that needs to follow in the wake of all of this. And I know, for example, there's also a temptation to shut down in the immediate moment residential construction, and I'm very worried about that. I know here in the Bay Area now, the 6 counties have said, well, we are going to extend the stay-in-home order to all residential construction. Wow. Unless there's a small affordable component to it. And I completely understand the logic there, but that does worry me a lot, because if this thing stay-in-home continues for months, it will really set us back on housing affordability issues. One of the things I think also that cities are struggling with is, just how do you free up the staff time to do that? Act on active projects to work on them, particularly multifamily projects. I'm less concerned about single family home renovations, but particularly on the multifamily side. I think that one solution may be that cities need to adapt their public processes on the fly. We sort of don't have the luxury to have half a dozen different planning commission, public council hearings, especially for projects that are already zoning compliant. And so, for example, the League of Cities has formally requested that the governor use his authority to toll the clock on any project that wants to use state streamlining authority like Senate Bill 35 or the Housing Accountability Act. I think that's the wrong approach. And I actually think if a project is coming into a city and it's zoning compliant and it's saying it's going to use objective design standards, now is not the time to stall that project out or to micromanage it. We need to let those kinds of projects go forward.
Right. We're going to come out on the other side of this in a lot worse shape than we're already.
I know. And it's, I think I've heard from some folks, they say, well, this is good. We're going to have a recession and finally prices will drop or rents will go down. I'm like, no. It's not that easy. The reason why rents are dropping is because people don't have the money to pay the rents. Yeah. So for every rent drop you see, it's because incomes are plummeting.
Right. Because the job was lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Balancing there. And then kind of the last question that we have is, and I just saw, and I actually haven't looked at it, but I think HUD just released income limits for the current year, and then HCD always takes those and then makes adjustments by counties. Do you think that in this process and in this cycle for this year that the COVID pandemic will be taken into consideration in adjusting those limits, kind of with the idea that, a lot of people are losing jobs? We're seeing unemployment rates spiking. We don't know if some of those people that are working in restaurants are going to be able to go back to work and, see increases in their income. So do you think that that's something that will be looked at, or do you think it's just so hard to get arms around, it'd be a hard factor to include into those adjustments?
Yeah, unfortunately, the way in which HUD calculates its area median incomes is inherently uses very much lagging indicators. And so I think what I've seen is there would not be any impact to certainly the current year, and under the current formula there would be, if anything, only a very modest impact to next year. So that's not to say HUD couldn't, under political pressure, sort of decide to make some exceptional change here, and they may. The other thing which we saw, the other thing is sometimes that helps in the sense that, for example, payment standards are higher for Section 8 contracts and so on and so forth, which can be very helpful just to keeping the lights on apartment buildings. I know there's a lot of apartment owners who are very grateful that they have Section 8 voucher holders in their buildings, because the Section 8 top line payments will remain the same regardless, even if the tenants' incomes are collapsing, right?
Right.
So in some places, not resetting those AMI baselines and those fair market rent baselines will be helpful too. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag.
Yeah, it'll be kind of interesting because it's with the RENA cycle already kind of happening and basically have being allocated and what that will be. It's happening, I guess, before this pandemic is occurring, and so we might be paying kind of a catch up where we actually would need more lower income units than potentially we originally projected as far as addressing RENA needs and housing element.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I don't see, in a way, HCD went through this in the last RENA cycle, which was also hitting during a downturn. And there may be a few adjustments that are made on the fly, but most of the councils of government at this point have received their allocations. They've already more or less locked in, and I don't think they're going to want to reopen that just from and the amount of work that's involved in reopening those numbers would be a huge undertaking. So I expect we'll just go forward with the numbers that we have, even if they're going to be very much imperfect. Look, I think the other just huge question is going to be, is there any more help coming from the federal government? I feel bad asking the question. I feel like we should all be grateful for the $2 trillion that was just made available in stimulus money last week. But the reality is, I think there's going to be a huge swath of renters in particularly market rate apartments that are just not paying rent. We will see this in a few days as the April rent rolls become available. But if you have, as some estimates have suggested, 40% or 50% of renters just not paying because they have had income shocks, that is going to ripple through the entire system. And even if we have anti-eviction moratoria in place, as we now do, all that does is kick the can down the road, because those tenants still have that same liability for the back rent whenever that moratorium unwinds. And so unless you have some deeper assistance, you're going to have a real challenge. And now, great, we have unemployment insurance and a $600 supplement, and all that is very helpful. And I think for those lowest income renters, it may cover their rents. But in California, you have a lot of middle income folks or low income folks who are paying $2,000 or $3,000 a month in housing costs, and that unemployment insurance doesn't begin to get you where you need to be.
Right, it's a drop in the bucket.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see. I've had even just some people, my friends, that are estheticians and those type of businesses that basically cannot work right now and are wondering, wow, how am I gonna pay my rent next month? And they're like, this one-time money is great, but we all know that this is going to be longer than one month, and are kind of looking for additional resources and tools to kind of help them get by with just basic rent and food supply. And these are people that maybe would probably have fallen into the low to moderate category, that they can make ends meet, and they can kind of figure it out and kind of live in the market rate world, kind of more at that moderate level, that are like terrified now because the income stops. So.
Yeah. Good. Well, I've enjoyed our conversation today. I hope it was helpful, and appreciate the chance to get to hear a little bit about what you're working on.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We appreciate it as well. So Have a good day and stay healthy.
You too. You too. Take care.